Tonight's guest considers himself to be a cryptozoology researcher, but he majored in anthropology at Keene State College in New England. He's been researching cryptozoology seriously for about 15 years now. And while it's true he's produced 3 feature-length cryptid documentaries, he's here tonight to talk about his most recent project. It's called the Manwolf Files. Of course, I'm talking about Karac St. Laurent. Karac, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Vic. How are you?
I'm better than I deserve. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well.
Great. Yeah, that's great news. Karac, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Sure. I consider myself a cryptozoology researcher, but I'm also an anthropology graduate here over in New England, in the United States. And I've been researching cryptozoology seriously for probably close to 15 years at this point, I would say, something like that, which is quite a lot of time because, of course, studying something seriously when you're as young as what I'm describing here, which would for me be less than 10 years old, you're kind of more just familiarizing yourself with popular cases. So not the most in-depth research for sure, but in terms of really trying to foster discussion in the field and investigate topics seriously, probably more like the past 8 years, I would say.
Karac, you like researching cryptids in general, that goes without saying, but you're particularly interested in cryptid accounts from Africa and Australia. What is it about accounts from those continents that piques your interest so much?
Well, as someone who researches, I guess you could say, global cryptozoology, I find myself fascinated with Australia and Africa for 2 main reasons. And I think that one is that there is this kind of, I suppose I would describe it as a sense of wonder for me, for those continents, because I guess it's the result of somebody who kind of grew up on adventure movies. And so I'm very drawn to things like African savannas and the outback in Australia and experiencing the cultures that live there and things like that, which is also what's drawn me into anthropology over the years. But I think as well, on the end of cryptozoology specifically, it is that it seems somewhat difficult to extract cryptozoological information from those places, more so than other locations around the world. Even remoter parts of Asia are a little bit easier to research than many of the regions in Africa and many of the regions of Australia. As for Australia, I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. I think partially, perhaps, it's that the case of the Tasmanian tiger or the thylacine kind of takes cryptozoological precedence on that continent. And so stories like maybe the Barnyard or other Australian cryptids sort of fall to the wayside a bit. And so the literature on them is rather limited. Whereas in Africa, I think that is very, I would say almost definitively, due to the fact that much of the research anthropologically, which is where we get many cryptozoological stories, is research that was conducted upwards of a century ago and more. It isn't that we don't have research being conducted there now and that we don't understand those cultures that we were looking into there. But I think that there's some kind of divide. There's some sort of point in time when the folklore of those places falls to the wayside. And folklore is where we get a lot of what end up being cryptozoological investigative prospects. So I think that there's been a lack of focus in the last century on African cryptozoology, perhaps aside from extremely popular cases, maybe like Mokele Mbembe or something. So it's hard to research it, but you find such interesting things when you do. And it's been quite an adventure trying to get newer reports, if there are any, from Africa. And you do come across some sometimes, but they're really quite hard to dig up. And so really, I would say African cryptozoology especially is kind of an adventure in and of itself.
You definitely made your work out for yourself by having those 2 places as the favorite places to get accounts from. Yeah, I can only imagine how difficult that must be. Not easy. You've made 3 feature-length documentaries, Karac. What can you tell us about them?
Well, my first documentary is called Release the Baudet Film. It's important to note, too, that all 3 of these documentaries center around mainly New England phenomenon, because that's where I've been mainly able to travel so far, just kind of in and around the region. Release the Baudet Film is about the Lake Champlain cryptid, referred to as Champ. It's often called America's Loch Ness Monster. But it focuses very specifically on this one piece of evidence from 2005 called the Baudet Film, which is this piece of footage that was aired very briefly on the ABC News Network, I believe in the subsequent year, 2006. What's interesting about the footage is that only a few seconds of the actual footage is shown, and it's spliced from different parts of the footage, so it's not even entirely linear. But what's there is actually really quite impressive. The understanding currently is that the footage was sold to an entertainment lawyer in New Jersey by the name of Scott Shagan. He currently has, I think, a price ceiling of around, I've heard many numbers. I think the highest number that I heard, although it isn't the most credible number, the more accurate number might be something like 20,000, but 100,000 was the highest cap that I heard for it, for a public release of the film. And some investigators have gotten the chance to, after signing non-disclosure agreements, look at the film. And the documentary itself is sort of about the importance of the film and what might even be the sort of wildlife safety-oriented aspect of Lake Champlain in regards to what kind of evidence that film could provide. My second documentary is called Wild Men of the Wampanoag, which is about a North American phenomenon, but really it's also kind of global, called the Pukwudgie, which is sort of a little hominid or little person type story. And you see this all around the world. You see this in South America with the Pombero. You see this in Iceland with the Holdafolk. Sort of an attempt to really kind of have the most in-depth piece of media on the Pukwudgie story thus far. The Pukwudgie is a Native American story. Specifically, it's sort of the Algonquin region. Several tribes kind of describe it, but especially, of course, the Wampanoag. We found some very interesting things filming that documentary. That was the most fruitful investigative piece that we had. Everywhere that we went in New England to investigate these stories, we had something odd happen. We had auditory phenomenon happen to us in New Hampshire. We had a physical finding happen at two different locations, one in Maine and one in Massachusetts. It was really a quite interesting explorative endeavor to take. My third feature-length documentary is called The Legend of the Marlborough Monkey. This is also a New Hampshire-centric documentary. The Marlborough Monkey is the name given to this localized Sasquatch story in Marlborough, New Hampshire. One thing that I thought was so fascinating about the case, aside from the name, because I'm a big fan of alliteration, was that it was so close to where I had been going to college, actually. I could walk there. And so I went there after hearing the initial story, which was archived online and kind of was left to the wayside for a while, and had my own experience with a wood knocking type of phenomenon, whatever it may have actually been. I was able to record it, and I've since recorded more similar sounds in different locations in Marlborough. And I've also talked to a family who has that kind of thing happen yearly during the summer, it seems, when they have the windows open and they can actually hear during the night. It's kind of a documentary that is half investigative and half going over the case. And as it turned out, there was a lot to go over because aside from the roughly only 2 reports that had been published online, I found an additional 13 that were not published online that I had found through being able to network with another researcher and talking to people as well. It was very fascinating in that way to kind of watch this whole thing not only be reborn as a case from the late 90s, but to unfurl itself even further right in front of me. So that was really quite interesting. And all of these can be watched on YouTube as well.
Of those 3 documentaries, Karac, if the listeners only have time to check out one of them, which one would you steer them to?
Oh, that's difficult. I suppose I would have to say it's a tie between Wild Men of the Wampanoag and Release the Woodhead Film, and it depends what the audience is looking for. Both of them are really great informational pieces, but I am much more proud of the quality of Wild Men of the Wampanoag than I am of Release the Woodhead Film, although I don't want to downplay what I think is the informational importance of that documentary. So I would say if you're looking for something that's a bit easier to watch, even though it is longer, I would suggest Wild Men of the Wampanoag because you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get good quality and you get a lot of information.
Well, all 3 sound like really interesting documentaries to me. I hope to have time to check all of them out.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome. If you've had a dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmenencounters.com and submit a report. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest on one of my 2 Bigfoot shows, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let me know. All right, back to the show. Your latest project is called the Manwolf Files. Please tell us about it.
The Manwolf Files is a documentary series, which is the first time I've actually tried a docuseries format. Because beforehand, I had done, like we've mentioned here, the feature-length films, as well as short documentaries, which I've been doing a lot of lately. They're just easier to produce. It hit me around a year and a half ago that I had not done anything on the Dogman yet, which is kind of a strange subject for me to tackle, because I take a very scientific approach to the entire cryptozoological subject. I was actually greatly inspired by things like, National Geographic and eyewitness documentaries when I first started up the Crash Course Cryptozoology program here. The Dogman was something that was so out of the zoological norm. I knew that I wanted to investigate it because I was a fan of researching Dogman, but I never quite knew how to. At one point, I was talking with another researcher, and we had discussed on 2 different occasions very popular Dogman photographs that had recently been debunked, and it kind of hit me that this was a very pervasive problem throughout the Dogman evidence base, more so, I would say, than really any cryptid that I've seen, because even with something like Sasquatch, which of course maybe is the most popular and so has the most hoaxes, there's a sort of proportionate amount of photographs that have yet to be debunked or reasonably explained as there are to hoaxes in the Sasquatch field. Whereas, as I've gone on investigating with the Manwolf Files, it seems that the Dogman field has just this overwhelming amount of hoax photographs. And that ended up kind of being the goal, to some degree, of the Manwolf Files. Primarily, I would say, is to sort of declutter the evidence base and take the subject very seriously, but in doing so, separate the wheat from the chaff, if we'd like to say it like that, to be able to filter out that which is definitively debunked and not worth investigation, and really focus on the things that are worth investigation, which is also why, as we investigate a new case every episode in the Manwolf Files, not only do we have most of the episodes being attempts at debunking, but we also have episodes talking to researchers about particular cases that we don't really have our own input in. We sort of just let the researcher talk us through the entire episode. So it's a general informative series, but the main goal is to kind of revitalize the scientific approach that the Dogman field can take and that we believe that it can take.
You just brought up the subject of hoaxed Dogman photos. Speaking of that, there's a well-known photo out there called the Barnyard Dogman Photo that you've put a lot of research into, and when you did that, you turned up some interesting things. Please expand on that for us.
Sure. The Barnyard Dogman Photo was not the first Manwolf Files episode that we filmed, but it was the one that we wanted to release first because we thought it was the strongest episode. This photograph is very pervasive throughout the Dogman research field. Ever since I started researching any of this, which again, for me, was just looking in popular cases when I was 7 to 8 years old on the internet, I saw this photograph everywhere. To describe it briefly, it takes place at night, and there's this kind of driveway or road in the center of the photo, and off to the left there's this street lamp, and off to the right there is this barn, and kind of adjacent to the road, closer to the barn, but between the barn and the street lamp, there's this figure, this kind of blurry figure. It's gray, and it appears to have this kind of snouted face. It might even have teeth, and it's got these pointed ears, and it looks very much like how one would imagine something like a werewolf to look. I don't think many people would have known it by name because there were no names attached to the photographers, but there was an official story of some kind. The story was that these 2 young girls were babysitting at their neighbor's house and had gone outside after hearing what sounded like an animal and had snapped this photo as this figure ran from behind the barn into the woods. And of course, after that, it's like, oh, they went back inside and called their parents and things like that. Again, everyone in the story is anonymous. There are no names attached to it. There are no links between the author of the article and the people given. There's no newspaper articles about it. So there's a few holes right out of the front. But, it's such a fascinating photo because in terms of maybe not knowing the story, but in terms of people who've seen it, I guarantee you it's right up there with the Gable film. If you've researched Dogman, you have seen this photo, whether you realize it or not. So we wanted to take a look at this because there was just something off about it to me. And one of the first things that I did, and this is a quite useful tool in especially hoax photographs that involve things like digital editing, was I took the photo and I did a reverse image search on it, which is something that a search engine like Google can allow you to do, which is it reads the image and it reads all the pixels of the image, and it essentially tries to find photographs on the internet that match either most or all of that image. So that was the first thing that I did, because realistically speaking, the dog man in the photo itself constitutes very little of the photograph. So if there was a scenario in which this dog man had been digitally put into the photo, the original photo should not be hard to find because it would match a great deal of the image. A 5-minute search and I found the original image. It was uploaded about, I think, 5 years before the photograph containing the Dogman version was uploaded to the internet. And you find that by putting in time frames and filters into when you reverse image search an image, and you find, the first instance that the image popped up on the internet. What it was is it belonged to this blog called Tiny Farm. And we did run into one problem doing this, which was that I was at college while researching this image. In college, internet restrictions can be rather tight. So any websites that don't have the proper protections on them, like most websites do, it can be hard to actually view those websites. So I knew the website was Tiny Farm, but I did not know how to access it at first because it would not allow me to, unfortunately. Luckily, we do have several programs online that can fix this problem, one of them being what's called a URL viewer. And what a URL viewer will do is it can take the link to a website that is not able to be accessed, and you put it into its program, and it will actually basically simulate, in some ways, the website for you. It will show you everything that's on that website, especially things like text boxes. So what I was able to do was when I found this version of the image that just had the background and there was no Dogman in it, and I realized that this was an earlier upload than the Dogman version, I knew I had to read this website's article on it. So I put it into a URL viewer, and this is all in the episode as well. And I was able to read the photographer's name as well as why he photographed the location that he did. Essentially, he enjoyed the aesthetic of barns, and so he had found this barn at the end of a road, I think close to where he lived, and just thought it was a very interesting photo to take. It wasn't anything more than that. Now, at this point in the investigation, we knew that we were looking at a hoaxed image. The question was, how was it hoaxed? Who and how was the main question now. We never really found out who. We assume, of course, it was the original article that had the story, but we don't know any names behind that. But we did find out how. There is a very famous piece of werewolf artwork that's really quite good, and you have several different versions of it on the internet. It's one of the only pieces of werewolf art that I found that's technically royalty-free in some versions. It's this sort of hunched-over gray werewolf, and it's got these very long arms that kind of go down to the ground, almost like it's knuckle walking in a way, but its back is a little bit straight. One of the arms is a bit raised, and the front of the hand is kind of flat and vertical to the ground, and we realized it looked quite similar. I'm a graphic designer, so I've worked in Photoshop before, and so I thought to myself, okay, let's see how much effort it takes for me to specifically use that piece of art to recreate this hoaxed photo. So what I did was I brought in the piece of art, and I cut out just the werewolf, and I put it into the center of the barn photo, and all I did was add motion blur to it, which, if you know rudimentary Photoshop, is really quite easy to do. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was stunningly close. I think the only thing that was off was maybe a bit of the compression and the colors, which are very easy to add. So what I did at that point was I wanted to make sure that I wasn't kind of overguessing myself, and I went to another program online that compares images and tells you the percentage of similarity between two different images. And with just doing that, which again took me about 5 minutes to do in Photoshop, the images were already about 85% similar. That was when we knew we not only had definitively found that it was a hoaxed photo, but we knew exactly how it had been hoaxed. So that was really quite a really invigorating case, and I'm glad that we released it as the first episode because I really do think it is our strongest episode, and it's very exemplary of what we'd like to do with the rest of the Manwolf Files.
I watched that episode, and I was really impressed by how you did that. Yeah, that was really good work. When you realized that photo had been faked, did that disappoint you, or were you just happy you knew the truth?
I was very happy that I knew the truth. And I think I was because the way that I look at this whole situation is I would love for there to be a really public and legitimate and just really as detailed as that image was, that there's no way that I could debunk. And I would have to say, this is either a revolutionary hoax or this is a real thing. I've not yet come across exactly that. There are some cases that have kind of had me scratching my head in terms of photos. But the reason that I'm happier just to know the truth is because I would much rather know the truth than put my faith into a hoaxed image. And the way that I see it, that actually gets us closer to figuring out what exactly is going on with this phenomenon.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, unfortunately, there's way too much fake dogman evidence and fake dogman stories floating around out there. That's horrible. It just does not further the cause.
No, it absolutely doesn't. I agree.
Oh, definitely. What would you say is the single best piece of evidence proving the existence of dogmen, Karac?
If I had to go for the single best, I'm really not sure yet, because I can't think of a single thing that's kind of had me look at it and really have me borderline convinced of anything. But I will say, and this is not an episode that we're doing yet, but we'd like to do an episode on this at one point because there's so much material to work with here. This might be a season 2 episode. Dogman footprints have really got me interested because there's kind of these two categories of kind of like a large wolf track and a more almost like a combination of canine and hominid track. And the large wolf tracks can be attributed to very large wolves or perhaps something else in some cases. I've actually done a video or two on my main channel for Crash Course Cryptozoology on YouTube on one of those tracks. But the canine hominid tracks, those have me really just perplexed, especially as somebody who studies wildlife, because obviously not all of them are the same. But you have this collection of them from all different people, from all different parts of the continent that are extremely similar, that if you knew for a fact were not hoaxed, you would have no choice but to say, these are all left by the same species. Now, one of the explanations that I've seen is perhaps this is some kind of phenomenon left behind when maybe a wolf accidentally steps into a bear track or something. You know, something of that effect. But the point is that the only two explanations that I have for the similarity between all of these footprints is the same exact phenomenon. Whatever that phenomenon is causing all of these tracks. And really, that whittles it down to some kind of weird coincidence of nature or a singular type of animal. And of course, I don't claim to know the answer to that. But for me, dogman tracks are the most consistent across time form of evidence that we have for something very strange happening.
Of all the photos of dogman prints out there, I'm sure you've seen that pic of the dogman print with a shotgun shell sitting in it, haven't you?
Yes, the Bendon footprint. Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's the one I did a video on, actually. It was a number of years ago, so I forget the measurements, but I was able to identify the type of shotgun shell, roughly, that was in that image, and use its length to calculate the length of the footprint. I found two interesting things. One is that the footprint was rather large. Perhaps not outside the realm of what a wild canine like a wolf could leave behind, but it was exceptionally large. I found that, and I also found that the length between the digits, the toes, and the pad of the paw, let's call it, was a little bit longer than I expected. What I thought was so interesting about that, and this is a sort of, let's say, a hypothetical thought process here. I'm not trying to say this necessarily means anything. Of course, there's problems in this case, like the anonymity of the witness and things like that. It doesn't mean that necessarily takes away credibility. It just makes it harder to investigate. But the thing with the digits in the pad is that one of the calling cards of a bipedal foot that we as a species developed over time was longer digits, longer toes. Especially of course, the body of the toe between the head of it and the actual pad of our foot. And I found that so interesting. because, this is an account and a phenomenon that described bipedal movement. One of the first thoughts that I kind of postulated on was, well, I suppose if you had a canine that at some point developed bipedal behavior, maybe that's one of the developmental changes that you'd expect to see. So, unfortunately, it doesn't really go much deeper than that because we have so little information on the actual case itself, but it was really rather interesting. It's one of the more canine tracks that I've seen that interest me greatly.
Do you think all the particulars you just mentioned about that pic, about the Dogman print there, more than likely prove that being a genuine photo of a Dogman print, or are you so on the fence that you wouldn't go quite that far?
Well, I'm on the fence in general, I think, because I'm not convinced that there's absolutely no such thing as a Dogman, and I'm not convinced that there is. I'm very open-minded on the subject, and I'd like to know what's going on. The only thing I'm convinced of is that there's something strange going on. What it is, I have no idea. I'm one person who's never had an experience of any kind, and hasn't been to any locations where there's been sightings, so all of my research has been either archival or, like I've mentioned before, looking at photographs. I think that the print itself certainly warrants investigation because, well, either it's suggestive of something like the Dogman phenomenon, or it is suggestive that we have kinds of wolves in the United States that grow much, much larger than zoological estimates would put them, and that alone may account for the many different quadrupedal Dogman reports that we get every year.
For anyone listening who's watching the YouTube version of tonight's show, I've got that print pic posted right now, so you can check it out if you haven't seen it already. You just told us your thoughts on evidence proving the existence of Dogmen, but what would you say is the strongest argument against them being extant?
The strongest argument against it? I think that one of the things that has me really kind of thinking to myself, that's a good point, especially as someone who's open-minded to the subject, is the lack of fossil evidence for any kind of even similar species to the Dogman. For things like Sasquatch, let's say, we don't have fossil evidence of Sasquatch, but we have fossil evidence of things that are exceedingly similar to Sasquatch. Gigantopithecus is one thing that many people point to for a Sasquatch relative, per se. And while I'm not convinced of that, if you had a bipedal Gigantopithecus, you would essentially have Sasquatch. And something like Paranthropus, a human relative, if you had a Paranthropus with an excessive amount of hair, you would have a Sasquatch. So there's very similar things in the fossil record to Sasquatch, but there's not really anything for Dogman. I have to wonder what that really says about what this animal actually is. Is it canine-like but not canine? A lot of eyewitnesses, of course, saying wolf-like in many scenarios, will also say things like it had maybe the ears and the snout of a German Shepherd, but it almost strikes them as more rat-like or more kangaroo-like or things like that. It kind of references several different snouted mammals. So it makes me wonder if we're dealing with something like that, if we're dealing with anything at all. And yeah, that's one of them. I think the other one would be perhaps maybe the timeline of these reports, because it is known that there are stories of what we would have called werewolves going very far back. But there's a difference between those stories and historical cryptid reports. And one of them is that when settlers were encountering what they called wild men, and what eventually became known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, there were newspaper headlines about these. When you go back to the same time period, you do not find headlines about werewolf encounters. You don't find them. It doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily happening, I suppose, but there is far less evidence for them happening. So that one has me scratching my head as well. I would say that those are the two things that really have me giving the skeptics their credit on that one.
Well, the biggest obstacle in the way of proving that they actually exist is the government pushing back and making sure that they never are proven to be in existence. I can totally understand why they do that, but as long as they are doing that, then yeah, there's just no way to get their existence proven.
Yeah, and again, as someone who's agnostic on the subject, I don't want to speak too definitively on that particular view of it, but I can certainly agree with people in saying there would be plenty of precedent for organizations covering up the existence of this kind of animal. I think you and I had discussed before things like species of owls have been covered up in order to not halt logging industry practices. If you had something like a bipedal canine, or a canine-like primate, or a great ape, or anything like that in North America, there is historical precedent for much less zoologically significant species having a lot of effort put towards covering them up. If you had something like a Dogman or something like a Bigfoot existent in the US, I do not doubt in the slightest that there would be plenty of reasonable, in terms of possibility, incentive for industries to attempt to keep public knowledge away from it, because it would halt so much industrial progress.
Speaking of cover-ups, a bit ago you told us about the research you put into cryptids in New England. You've also researched the attempts of the government there to cover up the existence of mountain lions. Why do you think they'd want to cover up their existence like that?
Yeah, that one's a bit strange to me because that's a known species. It's not like that's a radically new change, let's say. But if I had to postulate on that, well, first, I would like to give an example of the fact that we have some evidence that this is happening. There's a documentary put out by a researcher, Alexander Pedikov. It's called Lions of the East, and it goes over these cases. And in one such case, there was a woman, I think in New Hampshire, Vermont maybe, who had this rather extreme attack happen on her livestock, and she was quite concerned about it, and there was some hair left behind at the scene. And so she sent some of the hair for examination into a New England wildlife lab, and it, I think, came back as bear or coyote, and she wasn't convinced by that because she had seen both of those kinds of attacks before, and this didn't strike her as that. So she sends it to different labs across the country at one point, and they all came back as mountain lion. All of the labs outside of New England came back as mountain lion, and it was like 3 labs, so it wasn't one or two or something. So immediately that was strange. That was very strange. And there's also some talk among people who used to be in fish and game in New England talking about this cover-up, if we'd like to call it that. One of the reasons I've heard given by people who've allegedly been in the business is that there's all kinds of wildlife safety procedures and protocol that need to be come up with and then made public knowledge and then spread in a proper informational manner across the region when it is confirmed that a predator like this exists in the region. And according to these people, Fish and Game considers the eastern mountain lions that still exist such a small problem that it's not worth the resources to institute that. And so not recognizing the cases is far more financially safe, let's say. So that's what I know on that subject. What I can say is that I am convinced of the existence of eastern populations of mountain lions. Just in January, I filmed a short documentary called The Hampton Catamount, which was a short documentary that I filmed back in January with a couple of my, I guess I call them my co-workers to some extent, but they're my friends who have become investigators along with me on these cases when we do these short documentaries. At one point, this is the coastal New Hampshire area, my fellow investigator Griffin and I heard what we have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, after hearing recordings of these sounds and comparing them to other mammals in the area, we have no doubt that it was a mountain lion. We heard this on 3 different occasions in the same area within about 15 minutes of each other. We unfortunately did not see the individual that this was coming from, but we have no doubt that it was a mountain lion. And we think it was probably a male because it was not as high-pitched as a lot of female calls are. We did get one of these sounds on recording, and it's in the Hampton Catamount documentary, which again is on YouTube. We also had left out a bait sort of thing. We had left out a stake and a bag that the stake had been in up in the tree so the scent would waft more to attract predators. And the next day when we came by, the bag was out of the tree and the stake was gone. There were some what appeared to be paw prints in the snow, but it had rained, and so there was some distortion there. But we did notice that there were claw marks on the tree. All in all, we have no doubt that whether they're migrating in from the western areas or they've been here the whole time, there are most certainly eastern populations of mountain lions, and we simply have no doubt about that at this point.
It really is a shame, but a lot of governments hide their existence in places where locals know they exist. It really is a shame that they do that, but they do. I'm still unsure about this, Karac. Is your goal with the Manwolf Files to prove or disprove the existence of dogmen?
It's neither, really. We think that it's worth investigating, but that we can't really get a lot of serious investigating done if our database is composed of really easily disprovable photos that just aren't known to be hoaxes yet. We do not want the fact that we're disproving some of these photos to be a sign to stop investigating Dogman. It's more so to have some more clarity in doing so.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. You just want to get down to the facts, and yeah, like you said, if you don't know the facts, then how can you make an accurate documentary or form accurate conclusions? So that makes sense. How many eyewitnesses would you say you've spoken with prepping for the Manwolf Files?
Well, since a lot of our episodes center around photos that are kind of popular at the moment, not too many. But technically speaking, I think it's been, 1, 2, 3, probably between 3 and 5 so far. Yeah, between 3 and 5. And not all of that has gotten into the episodes and has rather kind of served as background research, let's say. But yeah, between 3 and 5. And there's plenty more that we plan to talk to as well.
Like you said, since most of the work you've done until now has involved analyzing evidence, I wondered if you had spoken with many eyewitnesses, but as time goes on, I'm sure that number will climb a lot.
Yeah, especially as you get into photos that are, it's kind of necessary to talk to available people on. We have one episode planned for season 2 that we're not going to be able to make much progress on if we don't talk to this person who publicly said that they took the photo. So there's going to be a few cases that we run into that will require that, I think, as research. So there's no swords of the prospect for talking to alleged eyewitnesses there.
Well, as good of a researcher as you are, I'm sure you're going to get to the bottom of it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. After looking into the dogman phenomenon as much as you have, Karac, have you formed any opinions about whether you believe the LBL murders really happened or not? Please go into depth on that for us.
Okay, yes, this is an interesting one. Our last episode of season 1 is on this particular case. What I would say is I don't think it is impossible, but I see a few major red flags. They're not to do necessarily with the idea of the cover-up. So, the LBL murder story was broken to Barton Nunnally by Jan Thompson, who worked outside of LBL at, I think, a convenience store when this supposedly happened. She is actually on film in one documentary talking about this. It's actually in a Bigfoot documentary by Tom Biscardi called Bigfoot Lives 2. And Tom Biscardi is a controversial figure, but this is just a flat-out interview with Jan Thompson on the subject. And she talks about having these 2 officers come in very early in the morning, like still dark, and them being visibly ill, and talking to her about this horrific scene that they had just come across with these supposed murders, or this animal attack, perhaps rather. 2 things that I noted about her interview were that, very importantly, she noted that the officers were supposedly threatened with their pensions had they ever talked about this more publicly. Second was the lack of any indication of specifically dogman-related phenomenon being behind it. Now, of course, it being in a final version of a film, that could just be maybe those scenes were cut out. But she at no point indicated having an idea exactly of what the culprit was, aside from just unusual animal. And of course, then there's the cover-up end of that. Neither of those necessarily presented red flags to me. One of the red flags that I did have was, this is a very popular story, and yet I have yet to see in any part of the country one missing persons report tied to it. And the problem with that for me is that covering up the actual killings is one thing, but a person submits and makes public a missing persons report. The military, for example, has no say in that. So the fact that these 4 people were never reported either in that county or in other counties, perhaps them having traveled from there, as missing, is a red flag to me. It doesn't necessarily disprove the situation, but it's strange that that's not there yet. I've yet to see one link to it. And maybe I just haven't found it yet. Maybe it is out there somewhere, but I haven't seen it yet. The actual story leaves me wondering if a known animal could have been responsible. Again, if we're saying that Jan Thompson, who was the first person to talk about this story, did not receive any indication about what kind of animal had done this, it makes me wonder, especially with allegedly the finding of one body up in a tree, if something like a mountain lion or several could have been responsible. One thing a lot of predator big cats will do is they drag their prey up into trees and leave them barely even eaten, half eaten. I'm not sure exactly what the reason for that is, but it's very well documented that happens. So it has a few hallmarks of known predators, and there's no missing persons report. So there's a few red flags. Again, it doesn't make me think it couldn't have happened, but I don't know if I'm convinced that anything happened. Not yet, anyway.
I'm not so sure what to think about that RV murder, but there are some compelling arguments proving that it supposedly did happen. I'm not sold on that, but the evidence that I have come across, if you could call it evidence, it seems to be pretty compelling in my opinion. Now, we talked about the RV murder, but what are your thoughts on the bow hunter who was allegedly killed?
I don't know about that story, actually. I haven't come across that yet.
Yeah, supposedly there was a bow hunter who was murdered by a dogman and hauled about a mile away from his tent. That is fairly well known in the dogman community.
I'm surprised I haven't come across that yet. I'll have to research that. That's a distance to be dragged. That is a long distance for a predator that we would know of to take a carcass. That's rather long.
That is a long way to go for a mountain lion, and also to understand mountain lions don't drag prey up trees. Leopards do that because they have to worry about hyenas and lions coming in and taking their prey, but yeah, for the most part, mountain lions don't have to worry about that, so they don't do that. So if the family was murdered in the area of that RV, of course the daughter was found up in that tree supposedly. If that really did happen, then yeah, it's very unlikely that a mountain lion was responsible for that because, yeah, that just doesn't mesh with their behavior.
I think I would agree with that. It's rarer than it would be for something like a leopard or maybe a jaguar that spends, for one thing, a lot of time in trees, but has to worry about some more ground predators than mountain lions do. But there are documented cases of it happening. I know that in New Jersey, there's at least two that I've come across, and it was on top of a rather short telephone wire in one of those kind of long valleys where you have the wires connecting. There was a deer that had been dragged up there by a mountain lion, and there was a carcass of a calf, I recall, that was found up in a tree at one point as well, with a mountain lion eating it in the tree. So it does happen occasionally. I'm not sure if it happens with people killings, let's say, because all things considered, when a mountain lion kills a person, it's usually not for food. It's a territorial thing. It's a self-defense sort of thing for the mountain lion. So I'm not sure what that would indicate about the behavior, but it does happen sometimes.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, almost any time I've read information about mountain lions, they've always said that they don't drag prey up trees, but never say never.
Maybe it's an extremely rare behavior or something. I would like to know what the situations might be, because I have noticed that, of course, the calf was being eaten in the tree, but the deer that had been dragged up was virtually untouched. So I do wonder what the practice is for mountain lions in when they decide to drag something up a tree, which, again, appears to be rare. It doesn't appear to be to eat it some of the time, so I'm not sure what that indicates.
Yeah, that does make you wonder. You've made observations regarding how interactions tend to go on social media platforms when dogmen or Sasquatch are involved. Please talk us through that and how you think eyewitnesses might be discouraged from coming forward with their experiences because of that.
I would say that for eyewitnesses who are cautious about coming forward because of the dogman community's more popular ways of talking to each other, I would almost say that it's a wise decision not to come forward, and I would say that it is if you're considering your mental health, because the dogman community especially, I would say, is very widely and needlessly hostile. And I don't exactly understand why, because some of that hostility is related to conversations about dogman, things getting heated when one person doesn't think a story is real and the other person does, etc., etc. But some of it is even just the kinds of people you find in there are very specifically unpleasant kinds of people, and I don't really know why that is. I don't know if it's that And keep in mind, I'm not talking about anyone in specific here. I'm making kind of general observations that I've seen being in Facebook groups and things like that. A lot of personal drama gets involved in the Dogman community. And I really don't know why the kind of people who are very open with that sort of thing seem to come into Dogman more than they do other cryptozoological subjects. I don't quite understand that yet, but it seems to be the case that at least right now, that's something of a trend. Part of me wonders if it's because the establishment of Dogman groups is a little bit less rigid than the establishment, let's say, of Sasquatch research groups, where you have not just the BFRO, but all other kinds of Bigfoot organizations. Whereas with Dogman, you have maybe less than 7 official groups, and that's kind of it. A lot of it is a very fluid community. So maybe it's not that this attracts that kind of person, but that this kind of person has an easier time getting into this kind of community. That would make more sense to me.
You know, for the longest time, I've wondered what it was that drew so many people with these acerbic personalities to this topic. I don't know for sure what it is, but there's definitely some there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a shame.
It is.
Of all the cryptids out there, Karac, that you know of, which one interests you most?
Oh, that's a very difficult one. I think the Yeti right now. As I've researched it more and more, I have become very heavily convinced that there is something happening in the Himalayas regarding some kind of unknown primate. That is a great degree because of, again, this kind of consistent evidence rule that I have. And not only do descriptions tend to match, and we have behaviors that seem to match, but we also have, very compelling stories for people like Arkady Tishkov, who is, I think he's still alive. If he is, he's in his late 90s at this point, really. But he at one point was Russia's most awarded naturalist. By most awarded, I mean literally he had the most academic awards of any naturalist Russia had seen so far. And in the 90s, he had accompanied a Chinese scientific expedition to one of the glacial regions of the Himalayas in order to study the ice movement there. And he had what he described as a Yeti sighting there, and he documented it very thoroughly in a scientific paper. And he also noted at the end of the paper that even though he had written this paper and chosen to publish it, that he would like to never discuss it again and would like people to refrain from bringing it up to him because he knew that it could damage his reputation. So somebody who is not only not gaining anything from it, but is intentionally trying to not gain from it, and who is just about the most well-respected kind of scientist you could imagine having this kind of report, supposedly saw an unknown primate that he described as ape-like in the Himalayas. For me, that was kind of it. That was, like, what else do I make of that, really? That would be like if Neil deGrasse Tyson, or if, I don't even know, if our leading biologist in the U.S. right now had what they could only describe as a Dogman sighting. I would have no choice but to think they were either going absolutely insane out of nowhere, or that there was such thing as Dogman. And there were no signs that Arkady was going insane, so I have to assume that there's some kind of either ape-like or that there is an ape in the Himalayas that we're not aware of.
You're right. When it comes down to it, there are 2 options. Either he was insane for thinking that, or he actually saw that. That's all there is to it. Well, it's about time for us to get out of here, Karac, but before we do, please tell us how the listeners can check out your documentaries, especially the Manwolf Files, then give us any closing comments you'd like to share.
My main output is YouTube, and I have 3 different channels on YouTube. My main one is called Crash Course Cryptozoology, but where you can find my documentaries is on the sister channel, Documentaries Crash Course Cryptozoology, and there have almost all, I've helped upload 2 of them, all of my feature-length documentaries, all of my short documentaries, and all of the Manwolf Files episodes that have come out so far. We're still in the midst of releasing Season 1, which is all we've filmed so far, and there's 8 episodes, and we just yesterday uploaded the 3rd episode. It's every Monday right now. So it'll be a little bit before Season 1 is done, another 5 weeks, but yes, that's the current stuff on there right now. And then my 3rd channel is called Voices of Cryptozoology, which is a podcast that I'm trying to kind of upstart right now, which is a sort of cryptozoological debate platform. There's only 1 episode of that so far, but it's a really interesting one, and I recommend people check it out if they would like to. As for closing comments, I would say there's nothing wrong with a very healthy dose of skepticism. if there's one thing that I've learned from making the Manwolf Files, it is that I need to assume that when I find something new in terms of evidence, I need to assume that unless I can prove to myself, or at least highly suggest to myself otherwise, there's a good chance that it's trying to fool you. So tread carefully with evidence, is what I would say.
Well, that's all very well said. And while I definitely agree it's always a good idea to have a healthy dose of skepticism in everything that you look at in life, I do know as a fact that dogmen are out there, and I'm looking forward to the day when you realize and the evidence is dropped into your lap that's going to let you know definitively that they're really out there.
Well, Vic, I hope it does. I hope it does.
Oh, I'm sure it's just a matter of time. And so that everyone listening knows, I'm going to post links to all those documentaries and the shows that Karac just mentioned, so that should make it nice and easy for you to find them. But having said that, Karac, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this information with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Vic. It was an honor being on.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks again so much for your time. Have a great night.